We are going to receive our third speaker in the person of Professor Bongmba, who has actually researched on witchcraft in Mbum. Apart from the fact that he is a seasoned intellectual and a university don, Professor Bongmba is an able son and elite of Mbum who is attached to Mbum traditions and culture. He will be throwing light on some difficult questions and issues related to this controversial topic, witchcraft in Mbum. You will not miss an inch or a minute of what he is going to say, so please stay connected and listen to Professor Bongmba. Professor, you're welcome.
Let me unmute myself. It's good to be here. I appreciate the invitation to be part of this conversation. I'd like to thank my predecessors for the insights they have given us. This is a very difficult subject because one, people, when they talk about witchcraft, they refer to the Bible. Number two, most cultures have conversations about witchcraft. Number three, almost all discussions about witchcraft lack a certain precision. And by that I mean just simply the fact that we don't actually know. We don't actually know. So the imprecision that surrounds witchcraft calls for, I think, a very careful approach to this subject. All of you know I grew up in Mbum. I heard so many accusations. There were people that one would go to. And so when I started studying, it really bothered me. By the time I got to the University of Iowa, studying with a social anthropologist, social and cultural anthropologist, Professor Roberts, I read for the first time in its entirety the massive work by Sir Evans Pritchard, which is the locus classicus, as they usually say. That is the main text on studies of witchcraft among the Azande. That was and remains probably one of the preeminent ethnographic studies of the whole idea of witchcraft, and that set me going. I mean, if you want a show and tell, this is the term paper I wrote for that class in the late 1980s in response to reading that book. But all the questions raised about it remain with me. In the meantime, studies of witchcraft continued among the Mbum. For instance, it seemed like almost all Catholic fathers of Mbum origin who studied at the major seminary in Bambui wrote papers or theses on witchcraft. Father Njinti, Father Mburu, and then there is, of course, Father Tatambui from Bui Division. And within Mbum itself, the academic studies of witchcraft were done by Peter Probst and Robert Poole. Robert Poole is still working in the Netherlands. When this program was announced, I had actually contacted him because I wanted to defer my own presentation to him. And he told me that he had been ill and he could not. And the reason why I mentioned Robert Poole particularly is that he went to Cameroon and went to Tapiken to study Kwashako. But in studying Kwashako, he realized that every conversation revolved around witchcraft. And the way it was always expressed is what all of you know. So when he interviewed people, people would say in Mbum, "Yumo omokuba." People would say, "Yumo omokuba." So he wrote a PhD dissertation titled, "They Must Have Been Something." And then when I talked with Cyprian Fisi, who lives with some of you in Washington, D.C., a good friend of mine from Etukebe Baptist Church, he asked me if I had read Paul's dissertation. I said, no. He said, I have a copy, I'll send it to you. So I received a copy in Boulder, Colorado. I opened it and I burst out laughing by myself just by the title. There must have been something. And that's where accusations start. And so I would go on then to engage not in an ethnographic study, but in largely a philosophical and theological analysis of the subject of witchcraft. Now, if you want me to put my cards on the table, I will put my cards on the table before I go on to make some remarks. If you ask me, do I believe in witchcraft? I'll say, absolutely no. If you ask me, well, but it is in the Bible, I will say, sure. The people out of the world which the Bible emerges were human beings like us, and they had their own confusion, their own phobias, and their own beliefs about these things. And it doesn't mean that when anything is in the Bible, that one can say that we can certainly conclude that it is true. Number 3, then, do I believe that witchcraft has any effect? Yes, it has negative effect because of the grand imaginary that has been built around this subject of witchcraft, which no one can actually define precisely what it is, but yet people talk about it with such authority, which makes you wonder. I mean, if we know so well, we know very precisely and speak with it about this kind of precision, why can't we solve it? So then when my own conclusions, and I can highlight my own conclusions. What I set out to do in my own study was to try to use appropriate terminologies. And by using appropriate terminologies, I argued that we are dealing with a large worldview, which involves tangential terms. What are some of these tangential terms? One, we call it in Mbum, fi, where fi. When we grew up in Tumbo, there was a certain power who was a healer, Pa Tamjong. It was believed that if you went to Njipchi for him to heal you, especially fractures, that he would enter a certain lake, and then after a short time, you would sit there and a python will come and wrap around your knee and lick yourself, and then in the end, that is how your bones would be threatened. I never saw that. I don't know if that happened. But generally in Mbum, we call that kind of power fi, and we never really attach any demonic activity to that. Number 2, a related term, I was able to argue that sometimes we call somebody who is suspected of being a witch in plural ri. But also the term mri or ri actually also just happens to be a description of people who behave badly. In addition to the fact that it's assumed that they have these sort of powers, when people, you can use the term mri loosely. You can hear a father tell a child, oh, are you Akwanri? But that is not always the fact that they are talking about witchcraft. Then I came to the term that we use regularly to, this is the fundamental issue in Mbum society. But there are all kinds of characteristics which I discuss when you look at the term truth, because there's really nothing in the English language that equates what we call truth. But there are several categories of truth. There is truth yibi. These are the type of people who believe that they gather together at night. Then you offer your own person, they kill that person, and then you share the meat. If you have eaten the meat of somebody, then it's like a ngwa. The day will come when you will give your own person. So this is to yibi. But I also argue that in the Mbum community, some people say, oh, why you went to yibi? So I said, came up with the term to yebu. They just see, and then they warn. In fact, sometimes actually, I think these people are the most culprit in my term, because they are the ones who usually bring up the allegations that somebody is practicing to. So then I coined the term to yebu. And then there are some people who don't have these powers, who don't chew up, people's flesh, but they just enjoy. For instance, after people have planted crops, then we call it in Mbum kirkir. Wind comes out and blows, or it rains hard and destroy things, and some people are accused. For lack of a better term, I call it tujar. Because and just you're just really spoiling the stuff of certain people. So I analyzed it further, but I will not waste all of your time. What I looked at then was the phenomenon in the 1970s, when the Mbum people were adopting the discourse on truth. For instance, it became very common to hear of Nyongo, to hear of Coupe. There was always a scare in schools when they say, "Mwemo avene Nyongo, mwemo avene Coupe." In the school, it scared people a lot. And both Peter Prof and Fisi also write about this. The whole idea that was borrowed from the Southwest of something like Famla. And the idea of Coupe was that in the Southwest, people went to the Coupe Mountain, and that's where they concocted all of those. And then here's where I still stand today. I actually think that the language I used was postmodern terms. And postmodern terms just refers to a period in intellectual history when people began to run away from firm foundations. Something that one can say, things are not always grounded and frozen, that meaning develops and even meaning evolves. And so when you look at the idea that meaning develops, meaning evolves, then what then can we say in relationship to witchcraft? Very simple. I think it's power discourse. And this is a complex issue. And when I say power discourse, is that it's power discourse in many ways. Those who claim to be witches do so because they claim a certain power. Then there are those who manage witchcraft, they claim a certain power. And sorry, Reverend, even the pastors who claim to manage and handle these things, they are claiming a certain type of power. So to then become some kind of power discourse, which is actually extremely manipulative, socially destructive, spiritually can be very destructive. But from my perspective, and here I will appeal to science, there's probably really nothing, whether we are talking about European witchcraft, because there's witchcraft in Europe, there's witchcraft in early New England, there is witchcraft going back to the Bible, but these are all social dynamics of power which people bring to the table. But number two, in 1995, I argued that is a significantly gendered discourse. We have seen it recently. We have seen the Ngwarong society escorting and beating 2 Mbum women. Several years ago, the Mbum community in Yaoundé had a publication which they call Kimfer. I have several copies of Kimfer. One of the important conversations that always came up in Kimfer was actually Mbum men in Yaoundé talking with such authority, accusing Mbum women of being witches with no evidence. So you look at all of the discourses about, again, it is discourse about power, but it's also a very gendered discourse. Your children are seeing it on the internet. Your children are seeing it on their phones, how their mothers and their aunties are being beaten and escorted on flimsy accusations that they are witches. And I think this is really, really, really probably the most frightening. The assumption that our mothers, the assumption that our sisters, the assumption that our wives, the assumption that our daughters are by definition witches. I think that's probably the darkest thought that exists in Mbum society. There's a lot we can say about this. But then I also concluded that it's actually economic discourse. In fact, when conversations hover around economic activity, maybe somebody is lazy, or somebody hasn't mastered a trade well, or somebody goes to school and doesn't pay attention to the material and so on and so forth, what usually happens? They pick up on an aunt, or they pick up on a grandmother, or in some cases, the uncle, and say they are the ones that are blocking the eyes of the child from studying. And so witchcraft then is economic discourse. I mean, I can tell you stories about how that played out in Mbum society, at least in the 90s, at the time when I was doing the writing. But there are several things. First, as discourse then seeks to speak to improper acquisition of wealth. When somebody succeeded, people just said, oh, they just assumed that was Nyongo. That was money that they went somewhere and took that money. That's why he made it big, which is not true. Sometimes you hear in Mbum, in those days, they used to talk of Mba Kupe, Mba Ble, Mba Majin, and so forth. So then becomes economic discourse, but sometimes it is used around because it is claimed that people use it to protect even legally gathered wealth. And so there's a certain ambivalence here. And look, the ambivalence here sometimes is very interesting, not only in economics, but even in terms of the expectations and anticipations about the remunerations that should come from somebody's success. I told a story of a famous Mbum person who had been educated overseas and so on and so forth. And when he came back to Cameroon, anytime he got ill, there was talk all over. You know, people who had not gone to school, people who didn't have money, people who didn't have anything, all of a sudden they became experts in protecting these people and pointing accusations at family members for being the ones bewitching these people. The interest here is the economic activity. They feel threatened that something could happen to somebody, this person, And they think by defending that person, they are protecting it. Of course, here then it raises questions about the distribution of wealth. And then finally, I argued that truth is religious discourse. It's religious discourse big time. And I think both pastors and priests and bishops, everybody is culpable here because they have bought very easily into the logic. The only grounds is that it is in the Bible. Well, yes, everything that is in the Bible is not something that one can establish. The people in the Hebrew Bible had their own confusions and their own phobias and their own fears about the world, their own misunderstanding of the world as we do today. And so you have Pentecostal pastors claiming they can exorcise, they can do this, they can do this. I mean, I will be the first to admit that this is a very liberal interpretation of the biblical perspective. But I will push anybody to show me how they have gotten the revelation that there's actually something as true. So bottom line for me, we are dealing with speculative discourses, one that has no basis in truth or something that we can establish, but that has been used from the very beginning of the world, even by people who existed, whose stories are told in the Hebrew Bible, to molest, torture, and badger, particularly the women folk. Let me stop there. I think I have overstepped my time. Thank you.